Good morning, viewers. Good morning, good evening, or good night, depending on where you are joining us from. Welcome to the third South Asian Literature Festival, which is running concurrently with the 16th annual South Asian Film Festival. Both these events organized by the SWIR, the organization based in Seattle, and focused on promoting voices, particularly fresh voices from South Asians, whether in South Asia or in the diaspora. So today we have a very exciting panel entitled Discordant Love, Queer Narratives. So this panel conversation aims at, again, new voices in the literary world, focusing on topics of sexuality, migration, desire, loss. It'll delve into art, politics, and challenges of bringing queer desi lives and experiences into the world, with a panel of award-winning authors, Nawaz Ahmed, who's joining us from Brooklyn, and Adiba Jagitar, who's joining us from Belfast. Moderating this session is Chandran Reddy, and I'll introduce him, and he in turn will then take it away by introducing our panelists and carrying on the conversation. We're very fortunate to have Chandan join us today. Chandan is a professor in the departments of Comparative History of Ideas and the Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Washington in Seattle. His now famous book, Freedom with Violence, Race, Sexuality, and the U.S. State, published by the Duke University Press in 2011, won the Alan Bray Memorial Award for Queer Studies from the MLA, as well as the Best Book in Cultural Studies from the Asian American Studies Association. He's currently at work on a new book project titled Administrating Racial Capitalism that explores the colonial knowledges and settler repertoires that organize contemporary racial capitalism. He's a widely published scholar and author, both in areas of queer studies and in political economy. Thank you, Chandan, for joining us, and I hand over the baton to you to take us to this wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Tayyab, and thank you for that generous introduction. That's very kind of you. I am so fortunate to be able to moderate this amazing panel that I've been looking forward to for months, to be quite honest. So I'm really excited for the conversation ahead. I am just merely the moderator, and so we're really going to be hearing from our two esteemed panelists. And why don't I go ahead and introduce each of them first? And then we'll head straight into the conversation. So first, we have Adiba Jagitar, and Adiba is actually joining us from Ireland, Scotland, I believe.
Ireland.
So Adiba was born in Dhaka, Bangladesh, and has been living in Dublin, Ireland, since the age of 10. She has a BA in English and History from the University College Dublin and an MA in Postcolonial Studies from the University of Kent. She's the author of The Henna Wars, which was selected as one of the best YA books of all time by Time magazine, and named a Best Book of the Year by Kirkus, and was a semifinalist for the Best Young Adult Fiction in Goodreads Choice Awards. Her sophomore novel, Honey and Issue's Guide to Fake Dating, which is really fun, is a Midwest indie bestseller. Her first YA historical novel or fiction, A Million to One, is forthcoming from Harper's Collins in 2022. And her next YA rom-com, Donut Fall in Love, is slated to be released in 2023 with Feiwel and Friends Macmillan. All of her writing, she says, is aided by tea and a healthy dose of Janelle Monáe and Hayley Kiyoko. And she says that when she's not writing, she can be found ranting about the ills of colonialism, playing video games, and expanding her overflowing lipstick collection. Adiba's most recent book, by the way, has just been shortlisted for the Irish Book List Best Book Award, so in YA fiction. Thank you so much, Adiba. We're so grateful to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Our second panelist will be Nawaz Ahmed. Nawaz Ahmed is a transplant from Tamil Nadu. Before turning to writing, he was actually a computer scientist researching algorithms for Yahoo. He holds an MFA from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and is the winner of several Hopwood Awards. He is the recipient of residencies from the MacDowell Colony, one of the best literary residencies in the world, VCCA, Yadu, and Geraris. He is also a former Kundiman and Lambda Literary Fellow. He lives in Brooklyn, and we'll be hearing from him about his first novel, Radiant Fugitives. This debut novel, I should say, has been reviewed by top critics in venues like the New York Times, the Kirkus Review, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Brooklyn Rail, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Atlantic, among many other publications. And I'll just quote from what one review states of Nawaz's work. Nawaz Ahmed writes the way an impressionist paints. He ensures the scenes unfold before the reader's eyes. The 384-page novel is a bold, sweeping book featuring broad themes such as politics, sexuality, mixed-race marriage, and a dysfunctional family. Ahmad's prose is simply imaginative and poetic. So with those introductions, Nawaz, also thank you for being here. I wanted to just go ahead and get us started. So I thought as a first opening for the panel, it would be so great to hear from each of you a short description of one of your recent novels, in the case of Adiba, because she writes one every 10 minutes, it seems, as well as from Nawaz's debut novel. And perhaps also if you would maybe provide a little bit of a reading so we can get a sense of your characters as well as the voice in the novel. And why don't we start with Adiba?
Sure. So my most recent book is Honey and Issue's Guide to Fake Dating, which is a young adult rom-com about these two Bengali girls, Honey and Issue, who decide to start fake dating. Honey, because she needs to validate her bisexuality to her friends, and Issue because she wants to become head girl at her school and impress her parents. But as their fake dating turns into something real, they need to figure out if they're willing to make a few sacrifices to get there happily ever after. So that's really what the book is about.
And Nawaz, would you like to share a little bit about what Radiant Fugitives does?
This is Radiant Fugitives. It's a novel that I worked on for 10 years, and I'm finally glad that it's out here. It follows two Muslim immigrant sisters, Seema and Tahara, who are living in the US. Seema is a lesbian who's going to have a baby, and Tahara has become devoutly religious over the past years when she has been separated from her sister, when her sister was exiled from their family when she came out as a lesbian. And so during 1 week, just before Seema's delivery, the two sisters and their mother from India come together in this apartment in San Francisco where they try to reconcile and try to mend the distances that have come up between them. And the novel is narrated by the newborn baby, who's just, as he comes out, is narrating what happened during that week. And he's trying to make sense of the complicated world he's entering as well, because it is America and there are divisions in the country as well.
So tantalizing. And maybe now we could go to a reading for a little bit, because I know the audience would love that. Shall we start with Adiba?
Sure. So I'm just going to read a chapter which is told from Issue's perspective, but it's kind of the first time that two girls interact in the book. Saturday morning, I wake up to a loud ping from my phone, reminding myself that I need to start setting that thing to silent since Nick has decided she actually needs a sister now. I lean forward and pick up my phone from the bedside table. The notification tab at the top of the phone shows that I have a message on Instagram. I shoot up to a sitting position, rub my eyes, and look at the screen a little more closely. I don't even remember having Instagram on my phone. I'm pretty sure the last time I put up a photo was at least a year ago, if not longer. I don't use Instagram because I don't care to see all the aesthetic photos that people put up there. I pull down the notification tab, expecting that a troll has managed to get through whatever filters Instagram has, but instead there's a message from Humaira Khan, of all people. Myra is dreaming. Hey, what's up? I stare at the message for much longer than I need to, trying to process the fact that Humaira sent me a message and that is the message she sent. We barely ever talk. We're definitely not friends, or even anything resembling friends. I have a bad feeling in my gut, even as I accept her message request. What's up with? Before I can finish typing my message, a call request from Humaira starts up. Has she just been waiting around for me to see her message? Why is she calling me? My finger hovers over the green accept button, slides to the red reject button, then back to accept. Humaira's face fills up my phone screen. Hey, her voice is too bright, like she's putting it on for me, and she's sitting by a window where the sunlight filtering in makes her glow a little too much. She looks like an angel, with the sunshine forming a kind of halo around her cascading black hair. What the fuck do you want? I rub my eyes again, stifling a yawn. I can only imagine what Humaira is thinking of me. I'm in my PJs with bedhead. Good morning to you too, sunshine, she says with a frown on her lips. Has anyone ever told you that you curse a lot for a Bengali? I fix her with a small glare. What does that even mean? Bengalis can curse a lot. Plus, I'm Irish too. Maybe I curse just the right amount for an Irish person. Ever think of that? She rolls her eyes, but I can tell that she's amused from the way her lips are twitching at the corners. I'm calling because she takes a strand of hair behind her ears and looks to the side of my head. Need your help. Well, obviously. Help with what? Did you fail your biology test? No, she exclaims, finally meeting my gaze. We didn't even get back our results yet, but I'm pretty sure I did well on it. Then what subject do you need my help with? She actually does smile this time. Do you think everything is about school? Do you even have any hobbies outside of studying? Studying is not a hobby, I point out. And if you want my help, you're not doing a great job of warming me to your cause, which I still don't know anything about, by the way. Humaira sighs. For a moment, I think she won't even tell me what kind of help she's looking for, because she just looks around herself, like she's trying to kill time or find an excuse or something. I'm just about to tell her to either hurry up and get on with it or hang up the damn phone when she finally starts speaking. Look, before I tell you, I just want you to know that this is a weird situation, and I just thought of you because I talked to you at your locker the other day, and in the moment, I couldn't think of literally anyone else. Okay, I have to admit that she has piqued my curiosity, even if I'm a little offended at how much she emphasized literally anyone else. She takes a deep breath and says, so yesterday, I kind of came out to my friends. Oh, that certainly isn't what I was expecting. She doesn't seem happy to be sharing this news with me either. She rubs at her arms and stares downward. Yeah, it didn't go as well as I'd hoped. They were really dismissive. I told them I was bisexual, and they basically said I couldn't be because, well, I've never kissed a girl. Okay. Well, so I had to tell them that I have kissed a girl because, right. My piqued curiosity has turned into a kind of cold anxiety because I'm afraid I know exactly where Humaira is going with this. So I told them that we're together. She finishes off in a rush. They already found it weird that we were kind of talking in biology, and I guess there was like a weirdly pixelated version of half of you in one of my Instagram photos from last weekend at that dawat. So it was just like the natural conclusion, and now you want us to stage an elaborate breakup? I offer, already knowing that's not what she's asking me. More like an elaborate relationship followed by a breakup. She's looking at me with so much hope sparking in her eyes that I almost feel bad about the fact that I'm going to crush her. You realize that this would be the most complicated thing ever, I ask. Have you even considered the implications? We would have to come out to the school, to our families, to the community. It's a big ask, Humaira. You can call me Moira, she mumbles. I do not want to call you Moira, I sigh. Look, I'm sorry your friends are assholes, but I can't help you. I'm not out to my parents yet. I didn't know you were, because you didn't think about me or how pretending to be in a queer relationship would affect me, right? Humaira at least has the decency to look embarrassed. She shakes her head and says, I'm sorry. I should have thought about it more. I can hear a waver in her voice. My parents are so accepting of my sexuality, and my friends were awful. I guess I was just so overcome with how terrible I was feeling. I didn't really think, whatever, I cut her off. Humaira is the kind of girl who definitely thinks she'll get what she wants by turning on the waterworks. Her friends are, after all, white feminists. If that's all, I have to go. I haven't even had a cup of coffee yet. Okay, bye. Have a good. I hang up before she can finish. Leaning back on my bed, I heaved a kind of deep sigh of relief that makes the bed reverberate. Dating Humaira Khan, or even pretending to, would have been a lot. I'm not even sure why her friends would believe for a moment that's actually true. We're so different, too different.
That is so amazing. It's so incredible. I just have to say off the bat that one of the things that you're so talented at doing, otherwise, capturing where young folks experience life, and to have such a kind of opening climatic event happen on the cell phone is just so apt and expressive of a milieu. So it was just incredible.
Thank you.
Nawaz, I would love to have you read for us as well.
Okay. First, let me echo that. Adiba, that was so much fun. And then I have to echo Chandan's thing about capturing that voice and the dialogue. It's such a pleasure to listen to, and the way you read it as well.
Thank you.
What I would like to do is read from this section of the novel, which is it is a political novel. So I'm going to read what I would consider a political section of the book. And this section is just on the eve of the 2008 elections. Obama has just been predicted to win the presidential elections, and there's a party that's going on. And Seema, who has the elder sister, who's the lesbian and who I mentioned earlier, has taken part as an activist in his campaign. And this is the evening of that. And in 2008, the presidential campaign in the US was also concurrent with a Prop 8 a referendum in California. Prop 8 was a proposition in order to add a same-sex marriage ban to the California Constitution. And that was likely to fail that evening. So this section is where Seema, who has married a man, Bill, whom she met while she was engaged in campaigning for Obama. And so that evening is this mixture of both victory as well as what feels like a personal failure for Seema. So I'm going to read from that section. At a private party in downtown San Francisco, Seema watches Obama speak, a glass of champagne in her hand. Because of what we did on this date, Obama says, change has come to America. The on-screen audience, hungry for a line to applaud, laps it up. Seema wonders briefly what Bill is feeling. He surely must be watching somewhere, but she's still too mad to dwell on him. She'd been standing all day on the exit ramps of Highway 101, south of the city, with a straggling band of volunteers flashing reminders to commuters to not only vote for Obama, but to vote no on Prop 8 as well. What can you do in one day? Bill had jeered. Bill is a husband. She had felt too ashamed, too guilty to appeal to Fiaz for something to do that last day. Instead, returning from Reno, she had signed up to join others like her, last-minute actors jolted out of their complacency as Prop 8's fortunes reversed. The previous weeks, proponents of Prop 8 had sunk enormous sums of money into scare tactics. Gay marriage would force the state's churches to participate in sin and schools to teach homosexuality to children. California would be devastated by earthquakes and droughts. They'd even sent out mailers using Obama's own words. Marriage is a union between man and a woman with God in the mix. And the Obama campaign did nothing to challenge them, beyond reiterating that it doesn't support Prop 8. The day felt humiliating. The desperate attempts to draw the attention of preoccupied drivers, the forced cheer when one of them honked in response. Even the most optimistic of that group exclaimed as the day drew to a close, flinging glitter to the winds is just to make us feel good we're doing something. Tired and hungry, they were shivering as the sun set when they were asked to head back, the ramps too dangerous in the fading light. People had begun celebrating Obama's win already, but it felt to Seema, returning to an empty home, like she was participating in an ending, not a beginning. She hadn't wanted to wait for Bill, though she knew he was on his way back, furious still with his obstruction, his accusations. Nor did she want to spend the evening with Fiaz awaiting the results of Prop 8. Divya's call was a relief, the invitation to the party an escape. The party is in a penthouse suite. Glass walls overlooking the city, the cheers and cries of celebration from the streets below only faintly audible. This 360-degree view of San Francisco is impressive, immersive, unlike the view from her home, and she feels like she's floating mid-air, encircled by resplendent towers, the landscape and sky a mute remote background. The interior is dazzling as well. White marble floors, blazing chandeliers, scattered furniture imposing like sculpture, a glossy grand piano, majestic and white. The TV, despite its huge screen, cannot compete with this glitz, and Obama appears washed out, outshone, even his voice sounding thin and tame. She turned her cell phone off, vowing not to check her messages or the internet until she's in a calmer frame of mind. But there's a buzz building in the room that she can't avoid hearing. Originating from the cluster of men by the piano, well-groomed and obviously gay, the bitter murmurs ripple through. Prop 8 appears likely to pass, though the votes in urban areas like San Francisco have yet to be fully counted, and the result may not be known till the morning. The expanded turnout for Obama is surely to blame, for exit polls show the majority of Black voters in California supported the ban on same-sex marriage. What swirls through her? It is clawing, vindicated disappointment. She'd expected this, had reason to expect this, to be disavowed and abandoned, like Prop 22 had done 8 years earlier, like her father had done in the decade before that. It is vindictive, expanding anger against Obama's feckless expediency, Bill's half-hearted support. The Black community's betrayal, if that was truly the clincher. Surely Blacks must know what it means to be discriminated against. The no on Prop 8's myopic white leadership, fearful of airing ads with loving gay or lesbian couples in order to allay the fears of straight white people, while ignoring input from minority organizations and shunning outreach in minority communities. The whining gay white men here, conveniently forgetting that much larger numbers of whites must too have voted in favor of Prop 8 for it to pass. And herself, for she's been such a sellout with nothing to show for it. What swirls about her? The dazzling constellations of lights, the glass windows, the glowing marble floor? Or is it she who's swirling, champagne flushed, in this brilliant hall of glass and mirrors with its 1,000 reflections, refractions, distortions, sipping Bollinger from crystal flutes, waited on by earnest tuxedoed attendants roving with platters of hors d'oeuvres? A veritable sheesh mahal, a flash of recollection, and she's performing for that entertainment, but without Anarkali's audacity to challenge and subvert. Let's stop there.
Thank you so much, Nawaz. And I'll just say for the audience listening to us from different locations that that characteristic version or that what Nawaz just read is characteristic of the novel in its entirety, in the way that Nawaz just elegantly always interweaves this sort of psychological history with political history, and the affects of each getting confused for the other. So it's really powerful, and it's a beautiful style of telling the political story as well as the personal story. So why don't we jump into our panel with these amazing readings? And I thought I would just open with maybe a very broad topic that is, or a broad question that's sort of to the topic of today's panel, which is, what challenges do you face while writing as a queer writer? And you could take that however you want, whether those are, challenges about the publishing market and the sort of world beyond, or just the challenges of the form of writing different characters as a queer writer. And anyone could start.
Adiba, do you want to go?
I can go. Yes, I can go first. I think there are a lot of challenges, but probably one of the biggest ones that I have personally faced is that as like a queer person of color, a Muslim, and specifically as like a Bangladeshi writer, there is no blueprint for the kind of stories that we want to tell. And there is no legacy that we can really follow. So a lot of the times you are kind of, or for me anyway, I feel like I'm kind of pushing through a wall and I'm being forced to break down barriers, whether I want to or not. It's not really a choice that I have. And so, what I'm facing often is that when I get rejected for things, it's, maybe I'll get a lot of microaggressions. And, a lot of the times it's not even because people are trying to be microaggressive, it's just because the narrative doesn't exist out there. People just don't know. It's born out of ignorance. And then I think that also often comes from readers because maybe this is the first time they've read not just a queer narrative, but a lot of the time even a Bengali narrative, but certainly, a queer Bengali narrative, a queer Bengali Muslim narrative. So again, the same thing crops up, a lot of ignorance, a lot of misunderstanding. So, a lot of the things that I get is like being mistaken for not being Bengali. Just a lot of people have expectations of what kind of stories they expect me to write as somebody who is queer, Bengali, and Muslim. But that's not the story that I am writing. But because so few stories exist out there, you're always subverting expectations, unfortunately, and you're always breaking down barriers. And it's good because obviously it means that there will be more people in the future, I hope. But as being, one of those first people writing these stories, it can be very challenging. It can be difficult and often quite lonely.
Adira, can I just follow up on that? Of course, I was actually going to ask you to write a particular narrative for me, but now I will not. But I was going to say, when you are experiencing these things, I was really moved by this comment that you made about so many people have stories they want you to tell. That's as much of an aggression as when you're having to break into a form that nobody expects a queer Bengali Muslim character to enter into. That I was wondering where you're receiving these messages and microaggressions. Is this coming through social media for you? Is this coming through reviews? Is it coming through literary workshops? It I was curious.
I think it comes mostly from two places, at least for me. The first is the publishing world itself. So again, when I was speaking of like rejections, I think even to this day, there's a lot of people who just expect us to be writing tragedies, because obviously there's, this big history of queer people only being allowed to write tragedies. And I think a lot of the times we are, rewarded for writing those tragedies tragedies, because we don't get to have happy endings. That's the narrative that a lot of people want us to tell. And I think a lot of people in publishing still kind of have that mindset where they reward you for writing those tragic stories. And I don't personally want to do that, because I'm writing rom-coms, and those have happy endings. And then I think you also do get those from readers who will pick up my book and who will say, like, this is like unrealistic, because why are the parents supportive, or why do they get to have a happy ending? And I'm kind of sitting there and I'm thinking, there are like 2 billion Muslim people in the world. I don't even know like how many South Asian people there are in the world. You expect every single parent of every single like South Asian and Muslim kid to not be supportive of them? Like, that is what is unrealistic here. So I think it's just both publishing and a lot of readers wanting to squeeze us into this very like narrow box and not letting us kind of tell expansive stories.
That was so helpful and clarifying. Nawaz, would you like to jump in and talk a little bit about the challenges you face?
Yeah, and I would say, Adiba, you are so right about there not being blueprints. And at least the blueprints that are there are kind of tragic blueprints in the sense of unhappiness. And I'm very, very inspired by your writing, these giving your characters happy endings in the rom-coms, at least. I think in my case, one of the biggest challenges is precisely that, in the sense that this feeling that you have this community and you do want to do good in some way, which means as well providing a happy ending for my characters. And that was one of the biggest challenge I felt with this novel, because it is not a happy ending novel. I mean, even on the first page, we know that Seema, the mother, is going to die. And that is something I put. And that's something I struggled with a lot. This notion that I was perpetuating this myth of unhappiness. And it was something, as a queer writer, it becomes like, do we always present our community as, do we present the challenges in our community? Or do we just present us as being happy, as seeking happiness? And there is this balance between that. We have to somehow show happiness as well as the challenges the community faces. And then I think personally for me, that was a big challenge. Like, having started on this book, which telescopes its ending on the very first page, how do you then continue with work that is tragic? And are you perpetuating this myth of unhappiness? I mean, it goes back for like 60 years or more. I mean, most of the books that came were pretty tragic books. And so for me, in this particular book, I think that was one of the biggest challenges is do we try to address that issue of can queer characters be happy? And the way I try to do that is by having like secondary characters who are struggling, but they're happier than in some way, or come to other endings than the main characters. So you have to try to somehow encapsulate a whole community in a book, just because you feel some loyalty to the community, some kind of burden you feel of representation, like, because there are so few of us, there are so few queer books. And then you begin to feel like, oh my God, my book is adding to this singular story, and how do we fight against that? And I think that was one of the biggest challenges for me in the writing of this book. I mean, in the publishing of the book and all the rest, there's a completely different set of challenges, which goes to like when you have publishers feel like the book is too niche, or it's not going to attract a big audience. And then you start worrying also about who is my audience and who's going to read this book. And how do we, am I, by labeling myself as a queer writer, restricting myself, or should I be also looking at to broaden the audience of the book? And I think that's another thing I struggled with while writing this book. Like, how do you write something that is both of this community, but also addressing this community in a wider political and social sphere?
I wonder if we could kind of pick up on that a little bit, Nawaz and Adiba. But I mean, both of you are, in some ways, I know Adiba is about to publish a historical fiction, but before that, both of you are in some ways writing about the present, about our moment. And I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about, what does it take to write about the present for you? How do you approach that? And this could be either, just your own writing process. So, at what point do you stop being in the world to write? Or is writing something that you're doing every single day while you're being in the world? And that's what it means to be writing about the present. Or, Nawaz, in your case, is it that you're diagnosing a moment of the present to get a sense of our moment? Going to this period in 2008, for example, and then is everything after 2008 sort of closed to you in your writing process to try to get through this, this novel and be in the world of the novel? So I'm just curious about how both of you manage that.
Go on.
Go ahead.
Go on, Nawaz.
In my case, I was pretty much frozen in time. My novel is set in 2010. And so I was immersing myself a lot in many things of that particular moment, which is, thankfully for the internet, it captures and in a sense it archives what is happening. So there were blogs, there were newspaper reports, there were videos from that moment. So there was a lot of research that I had to do to write about the historical period from 2003 to 2010, which is roughly where the current of the novel is set. So that was where my mind was at. But at the same time, history doesn't stop. I mean, in 2010, I was trying to write about, when I started this, I think there was a lot of fear in the US that the states would go on to be able to ban, at least some of the states would go on to ban same-sex marriages, for example. There was also the fear that there would be Islamophobia was also on the rise in the US around that time. And there was that fear that that would also go on to become more prominent. In one case, it did. In 8 years, we had Trump come up, and then he brought in the Muslim ban, and then there was this entire, there was the fears that I had about that came true in a sense. On the other hand, during those same periods, the same-sex marriage actually had a kind of success, right? I mean, we had, at least in the US, we had the, in 2015, we had the Supreme Court legalize same-sex marriages. And then you begin to wonder at that point, like, is this thing I'm writing about still important? Like, has this moment sailed? Or am I writing about something that's now in the past and of no relevance anymore? Like the same-sex marriages are, at least in the, for the time being, at least legal. And so there was that doubt I had. Should I rethink my novel? Am I, is it important enough still to capture that historic moment when there was so much fear? And that was something I had to deal with myself. And then the way I negotiated that was that it did capture a particular historical moment. And there are these fears. And there is, even now that the Supreme Court has changed, there is some kind of fear that things may go back. We do not know. I mean, there are still so many other battles in queer circles that have to be fought. I mean, now there's the focus has shifted to transgender rights, and we are still in the same place. We are still having states that want to ban rights and things like that. So my hope while continuing to write the book was that these things are not going away. The things may have shifted a bit, but the kinds of battles that we are fighting are still ongoing. And that, I think, gave me strength. Like, it's important that we document the kind of political impasse that we sometimes run into, the political expediency that we run into when some of these issues that only affect minorities become prominent. I mean, as minorities, we have so little power. The main thing that we can hope for is that some portion of the majority throw their lots with us. Otherwise, nothing much is going to get done. And so I think it was important to me to try to continue writing the book to address that kind of blindness that sometimes comes over us. So that's so it was both keeping an eye out on both the current and on the past for me.
Adiba, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I think your answer was brilliant. I think, all writers who are writing contemporary novels should be thinking with that mindset. For me, I think a lot of the times when writers are trying to write in the present, they get too caught up in what the present means.
Yeah.
So I think, for example, with COVID, there was a lot of discussion about what would it look like to write about COVID, into books. And, it's an important discussion because obviously it's a very important moment, which will be, very important in the history books, obviously. But again, I think it's getting too caught up in what does the present mean. So for me, I guess when I'm trying to write, I don't try to think of it as writing in the present. More, I try to think of it as writing in the world of my characters, because no matter what time period you're writing in, like, your characters' worlds are really the most important. And obviously, yes, politics can like bleed into it, current politics, current events, and all of that. And if that shifts in some way, it can also be relevant to your characters. Like Nawaz said, most of these things, they remain relevant in one way or the other, which can be both positive and negative, obviously. But I always try to think about the world of my characters that I'm building, and what is important there rather than what is present for me.
That's so helpful. And I wonder if that might lead us straight into some questions about your writing process, because I know that audiences are always wanting to know about authors' writing processes, in part because they might be themselves embarking on writing projects themselves. So I'd love to just hear for each of you what the writing process looks like for each of you. I mean, one, Adiba, you speak about, writing, the challenges of writing in a part of the literary world that requires being prolific. And Nawaz, you talk about the challenges of writing a book for 10 years. And that style, which is another style of literary production. Many great books have been written over a 10-year period. And so I'm just curious if you could share a little bit about your writing process.
Do you want to go first, Nawaz?
Okay. The book is, as I said, did take 10 years. And my writing process over those 10 years has remained roughly the same. which is a few hours every day on the book. And what I was in a very lucky position. I was a computer scientist before I became a writer. And when I quit to write, I gave myself a few years in order to finish the book. I thought at that time, like 5 years would be a good amount of time to get the book out, to finish it, to have it published. And so I took time off from my work. I quit my job and I said, this is what I'm going to do full time. And so I structured my days pretty much like a work day at work. I would in the morning get up, I would read for like an hour or so, just some book that I hope to learn from. And then before I wrote, I would read various small things, poetry, for example. I'm a big fan of poetry, and it shows in the book, I think, that part of the narrative includes poetry. And then I would spend 3 to 4 hours roughly a day working on going through my previous day's writing and then progressing to the next day's work. One of the reasons, and then the first draft actually took like roughly a year and a half to do. One of the reasons why the subsequent drafts started taking longer and longer was that the book itself grew longer and longer. From 120,000 words, which was my first draft, by the third or fourth draft had grown up to like 200,000 words. Because one of the things about some of the research I did was that you begin to want to put everything into the book. And so the book grew to like 200,000 words. And then just reading the book once through would take days, and just revising the book once through would take, like, instead of months, began to take a year or more. So my process of writing, I think, got slower and slower just because there was more and more to go through. Especially as the politics and all the rest got into the book. They were not so evident in the first draft, but I began to see the holes, and the holes required me to flesh out what in my first draft, for example, I would just say Seema was a political activist. But in order to give that life, I had to actually go and say, if she was a political activist, then what campaigns did she actually work in? And how did she relate to what were the events going on around that time? So I think that required a lot of fleshing out and reading and reviewing and watching videos of that time in order to get some of the details right about the various campaigns. So I think as the years progressed, the book actually slowed down. So, which was another reason why it took 10 years. And then I think the last draft of it, which I worked on my editor during COVID, was the absolute reverse of that process, where we had like 4 months to go through these 200 pages and try to pull it together, which was like completely something that I had not attempted to do during my entire writing of the book. So it was a different mind-bending process, because there was the pandemic outside raging, and there was this book that was like suddenly falling into shape over a course of like 4 months, where it had taken like 9 years to get to that point. Yeah.
That's amazing. And I have to be honest, my writing process is the exact opposite to yours, Oasis. Because, I used to be a teacher. And so when I was teaching, and, that's when I wrote my debut as I was teaching the Henna Wars. And then after that came out, just before it came out, I quit my job and, started working more seriously on the writing. But when I was teaching, I would write, on the weekends. I would be writing, basically doing a 9 to 5 on the weekends, because it was my only time to really write. And I would often be writing on the commute to work and coming home from work. So it was, that was very difficult. And I don't think I could ever go back to that, because it was, never getting enough sleep, and always doing some work. And now that I have, quit my day job, I think I had wished to have, a daily routine like you, where, I would wake up and I would pretend it was my day job and work 9 to 5. But unfortunately, it doesn't really work like that for me. I always say that I am kind of a chaotic writer, so I don't really have a specific writing process. So I kind of try to do something new almost with every single book and see what sticks. And so, sometimes I have outlines and I write off outlines. Sometimes I have no outlines and I don't write off outlines. Sometimes I'll write every day. Sometimes, I just don't want to write, so I don't. There are days when I've written like 10,000 words in one day. Days where I write or weeks where I'll write like 0 words every day. So I think I basically just follow where the creativity takes me and see what happens. And if something works for one book, it doesn't necessarily mean for me it's going to work for the next book. So, I've kind of tried that where I'll think, okay, it worked for this book, so let me try to replicate that. But, every book is different. So the process of every book also looks very, very different. So yeah, basically for me, I've tried a bunch of things, and I'm always open to trying different things in the writing process. And I just kind of follow where the creativity takes me.
Maybe I can follow up on that, just to delve a little bit more into your writing process. And as you said, every book is different. So maybe this is in relationship to the Henna Wars, or Hani and Ishu's Guide to Fake Dating. For each of you, does the novel unfold through your attention to characters? Do the characters lead you in a way to the next part of the novel? Or are you more driven by a plot, for example, and you kind of see the plot and then you have to find the characters and learn who the characters are once you have the plot? I'm just kind of curious for both of you, how Nawaz, you've spoken about research, for example, which suggests, that you're very plot driven and you're thinking about those elements in the plot. But I'm wondering, are you also driven by your character and when that dynamic enters for each of you?
I can go on that. I think they seem to me to actually interplay, that there are times when there's the plot taking precedence, and then there are times when the characters take precedence. For me, one of the things when I started the book was I had this picture of these 3 main characters, these 3 women. They came to me one morning. This was like 13 years ago. And all I knew about them was that one of them was pregnant, one of them was devoutly religious, and the mother was dying. And that is all that I had when I started the book. And so from there, it was really, the process was a question of exploration. Like, who are these people? And why are there these divisions between them? And so I think each draft, in a sense, was trying to look at what I had and try to make sense of these characters. So the first draft, I think, went a lot into one of the sisters, Tahara, and her journey, who's the religious sister, and her journey. And then I felt in that draft that Seema's journey as an activist and how she came to that was not developed in that draft. And that's why in the next draft, I really concentrated on trying to figure out who was Seema and how did she come to this particular place in her life. And so it wasn't really about the plot at that point. It was a question of discovery, like what kind of life choices would have brought Seema to this point in her life. And when I finished with Seema, then you had these other holes that I had created, like who was a husband, and then what is the mother's journey? So I think each of these then became their own explorations, draft after draft. It wasn't, and then the plot became something like a framework. You had this plot of the book, and now you had to figure out like who are these characters who came to dwell in this plot, and how did they come to be who they are? And I think it was almost anthropological, where you just go and say, okay, I'm trying to figure out who these characters are and how do they fit in. And you're also constrained by the plot in the sense that certain things have to happen in the plot, and then you are like trying to figure out what kind of background would lead to this kind of action that they took or not. How do you explain their motivations? How do we understand who these characters are and how the world and their past was imposed its constraints on them? And I think every draft was really a question of taking some things away and like some of the crud away, so I could see clearer who these characters are. So the book, I think, eventually became a question really of a character study. These three characters caught up in the world, and the world itself became a character. So it was like, what aspects of the world impacted these characters? And so it became a question really of figuring out who these people were and who the world is. So I learned a lot.
Yeah, for me, it was also honestly very similar, because I think plot and character, they interplayed a lot as I was trying to come up with the concept and trying to write the book. So the first thing that came to me with Honey and Issues Guide to Fake Dating was fake dating, because it's one of my favorite, tropes. I love movies with fake dating. I love books with fake dating. And I realized that there was so little queer fake dating stories out there. And so, what I really wanted to do was I want to write a queer fake dating rom-com. And so that was the seed of the idea. And then, I had to ask myself a lot of questions about what would be the reason for two Bengali girls to be fake dating? What would give them the motivation to do it that would actually work within the story? And then, what would they be trying to achieve with the fake dating? So once I kind of had the answers to those questions, I had my two characters, Honey and Issue. And then a lot of it was, I was actually building the two characters opposite each other. So, Honey and Issue, when I was writing them, I wanted to show these two very different ways of being queer and being South Asian. So I started with started with Issue because she's the first chapter. And so Issue was somebody who's very blunt. She doesn't care what people think of her. So then Honey had to be the opposite in a lot of ways. So I was kind of building these characters opposite each other and thinking about what kind of a story would require these characters, but also what kind of characters would require a story like this. So I think, those two answers are really the most important thing when I'm writing any kind of book, because I think, I want to write books or I think a lot of people want to write books where only these characters can occupy the story, and only the story can only be occupied by these characters. So you want that story to be very, very specific. So yeah, I just like Nawaz, character and plot, they work together, and they hopefully create, stories that are unique to both.
That's so rich and interesting. And I'm actually going to add a audience question here before we move into another topic, because it's on the question of your process. The audience wants to know if you each have writing groups that you share your writing with as you're working on it, or whether you're a more private writer and you don't have a writing group per se.
I have not a specific writing group, but I have critique partners who are also authors. And usually where my critique partners come into play is actually just me asking them a lot of questions when I'm developing ideas and characters, because that's really where I tend to get stuck. And I think it's sometimes the most difficult part of the writing process, because you're trying to work out like all the kinks of the plot. You're trying to work out all the like plot holes and everything. So then it's kind of, I'll often, call up one of my critique partners and I'll say, I need some help, and I'll ask them a lot of questions. And often I'll figure it out as I'm speaking to them, and I'll be like, thank you. And they'll say, I've done nothing, but you're welcome. So, it works out like that a lot of the times. But yeah, if I need, a second look at some of my pages, it's, this group of friends that I will send it to. And because, it's critique partners, they will also do the same. I will also do the same for them. So, if they need help, I will help them. And I think, for me, it's been like a really good system, and it always really, really helps me. And I definitely encourage, any writer to seek out critique partners that you trust.
I agree with that. I mean, having somebody whose critique you trust is very, very important. One thing about the way I was working, I think I came out of working on this book after my MFA, and we had done a lot of workshopping during the process where you shared chapters or you shared short stories, and then you had 8 people sit in, or 12 people give you various comments. And I was a bit weary of that kind of model. So I think for the first couple of years, I actually didn't show the work to anybody. I was like, also, I felt like hard to show the work in small chapters for a novel. I think if you're writing a novel, it feels easier to actually show the whole thing rather than just show small parts of it, because people can't really make sense of what the book is about without seeing the whole thing. So I think the way I worked was, but I would work on the entire book by myself pretty much most of the time. And then I would find some readers who I trusted, who would read the book and then give me feedback about various aspects of it. And a lot of time, it wasn't exactly the feedback that they gave, but just talking about the book and trying to see what I was trying to do with respect to how they were viewing it would give me answers. Like you said, I would like know that this is what I need to do in the next draft. Mm-hmm. And then there would be another couple of years, 2.5 or 1.5 years, or whatever, when I would just go away and work on that. And then and that process kind of continued. At some point, instead of having critique readers, my reader became my agent and then my editor. So I think the process just became like this one reader and this one. But towards the end, I again had to go and get much more feedback from various different types of readers. But as I said, I always did that after the entire thing was written, because during the writing of it, I felt very protective of the work, like that they can't really give me feedback unless they see the entire thing.
That's wonderful. And I want to transition us to talking a little bit about the politics of reception, but maybe to get us there, a transition between the writing process and reception is just to ask each of you if you have imagined readers when you're writing in your mind, and who are those imagined readers if you do have them? How does that fit into your work?
For me, because I am obviously writing for a younger audience, for teens, my imagined reader is myself when I was younger, because I didn't have these books when I was younger. So I kind of try to think of what would have been meaningful for me. And I kind of go from there. And so, as I'm imagining a younger me, I'm also imagining all the young South Asian kids who are teenagers now and who maybe still haven't seen that kind of representation.
I think the audience for my writing kind of changed over the years. when I started off, there was all this huge young writers thing of I'm writing for everybody. Everybody's going to be excited about this book. That was like, it's how I started writing the book. But as the years went by, I think it became clearer and clearer that I needed to not think of the book as something that was going to be read by all, but to be more specific about who I wanted the audience to be. And I think the reason it became clearer was that what I was trying to do, I think, in writing the book was, in a sense, a kind of an intervention. I had these two communities that I felt were at the core of the book, the Muslim community and the queer community. And I wanted to write the book in such a way that each could not ignore the other. That these two communities may be able to get what they wanted from the book, but not at the expense of ignoring the other community. When I was thinking, and in a sense, because I had these two characters, Tahara, who was this very religious person, and Seema, who was this very liberal lesbian activist, and I had these two very opposite characters, and I wanted each one to, at least for me, if not whether the characters themselves grow to understand each other, that the readers should be able to hold both these worldviews in their mind and not be able to say that's a terrible thing or that's wrong. I wanted people from both communities to be able to take in both these worldviews and try to make sense of it, so that you do not that you cannot ignore. Yes, there are certain things in Islam that may not fit in very well with a queer worldview, and yes, there are things in the queer worldview that may not fit in Islam or how we think of Islam. And so I wanted that kind of tension to exist, so that readers don't don't just take what they wanted, but are forced to be confronted with this other thing. And so I think I began to have to think about, am I, with respect to these communities, am I at least being honest and fair to them?
Maybe I'll follow this up, Nawaz. There's an audience question for you that I'll just read. It says, in response to the critics of My Beautiful Laundrette, Hanif Qureshi said that he would write what he wanted to, as he was not an ambassador for Pakistan. What are your views on this?
I admire that kind of forthrightness. And I do think I do want to write what I want, but I feel as a writer, we also have to be cognizant of where our own blind faults, where we are, our own shortcomings are. And that is, I think, important. So writing what I want is okay, as long as I know that that is exactly what I want and why I'm writing that. And if I have certain shortcomings in myself, certain prejudices and other things, I don't want those prejudices to get into the book. So I would, as a writer, I think, question and explore my own prejudices. Like, is there something about my prejudices that are making me be unfair to these characters? And how can I eliminate that? So yes, write what I want, but also look carefully at why I want to write it that way.
That's really great.
How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I agree with you. And I also think, going back to what I was saying at the very beginning about sometimes being the only voice and having to kind of be the person breaking down walls. Unfortunately, that does come with responsibilities, because, I can say I'm going to write what I want, and, I don't care what anybody thinks. I can do that. But the people who may be harmed by that are community. So I do believe, each of us, whether we want to take on that responsibility or not, we have a responsibility to our communities. And I think it's important for us to think about, how narratives exist for our communities and what narratives we are personally giving them. And so, I think, in an ideal world, all of us would be able to write whatever we wanted without ever really having to think deeper about it. But unfortunately, because, so many of our communities are minoritized, whether we're talking about the South Asian community, the queer community, the Muslim community, I think we do have to give deeper thought when we are writing these stories and these characters, and we have to think about what impact they may have on our communities, but also what are people who are not from our communities going to take away from reading these books.
That's great. And Adiba, there's a follow-up question for you in the audience questions. It's what kind of reception does your writing have in Bangladesh?
That is a really interesting question. And actually, I am not sure, because I don't think it has had a big impact in Bangladesh. And obviously, being queer is still, illegal in Bangladesh, sadly. So I can't imagine, if people have heard of it, that there is a big positive response. There are, Bangladeshi people who I see, online, who are very excited about the book and who are very excited to see that representation. So I'm assuming, there are Bangladeshi people who have picked up the book. But the book doesn't have a Bangladeshi translation. I don't know if it's available in Bangladeshi shops. So honestly, I am not sure.
And maybe Nawaz, we could ask similarly. I know your book has only been out recently, but has the book been released in any part of South Asia, and have you had any reception yet from those readers?
To answer that question, yes, the book has been released. It's very recent. It came out in India. There is an Indian edition, which, as far as the reception of it, I'll have to echo Adiba's thing. I really do not know. For one, I'm out here in New York, and the book is just come out in India. And two, even amongst my family, there is this sense of silence that surrounds. Yes, he has a book, so congratulations and things about the book, but people speak about it in very general terms. So he has a book, congratulations, but nobody really wants to actually go and grapple with, I think, with the queerness of it yet. So I have not yet had anybody talking to me about the queer aspects of the book. The other aspects maybe, but not the queer aspects. Yes,
that's so helpful, because the sort of final question I wanted to ask each of you, and thank you for being so gracious to staying with us in this conversation for so long, is really that question, Nawaz, about asking both of you what queer means to you when you're thinking specifically about desi writing or South Asian young adult fiction, and I mean that in a both a non-identitarian sense, or maybe it is identitarian. You just want to have queer characters, but maybe also queer is a kind of sensibility or a suppressed history. I'm just kind of curious what queer does mean to you as a South Asian writer.
It's a difficult question.
Yeah.
I think, when I started kind of writing queer South Asian books, I wasn't necessarily thinking I'm going to write a queer South Asian book. I was thinking I'm going to write the story that I would have liked to read when I was younger, and a story that I haven't really seen out there. But then, as I kept writing and as I kept, I suppose, learning, and I also, this kind of goes back to my education as well, because, I do have an MA in post-colonial studies. So a lot of the things that I learned during that part of my education was about how a lot of queerness was stamped out during colonialism. It was definitely stamped out in South Asia. It was stamped out in many other parts of the colonial world. And so I kind of learned a lot more about, what queerness looked like in South Asia before, the British came and colonized us. And also, I think that led me to thinking about, what queerness looks like now in South Asia because of colonialism. And I suppose, even though, I am writing rom-coms, all of these things that I know of queerness and South Asianness go into the writing in some form or other. So I'm always trying to write with, I suppose, a kind of deliberateness, that it's not just, I'm just writing a story and the characters happen to be queer and they happen to be South Asian. I'm always trying to create that connection between queerness and South Asianness, and I suppose in a lot of ways trying to reclaim the stories that have been stamped out and that that we haven't been able to tell, and all of these narratives that I think are really, really necessary. And unfortunately, they have been erased. So I do try to be very, very deliberate. I try to celebrate queerness and South Asianness because I know so many people, unfortunately, still view these things as opposites, and they are very much not opposites. They have existed together for a long time in, our little region of the world.
That's a wonderful answer. Yeah, I like that answer a lot, Adiba. The question of trying to restore the erasure. And I think that is something I think, wanted to do quite consciously. And that's why when I spoke about not where one community can't ignore the other, I think that was about the visibility, like making us visible enough so that we can't be erased. So one of the things I did was put my queer characters in my novel, at least, in all these places and moments where you wouldn't normally see them. For example, in that scene I read, I put the queer character in during Obama's victory, because I think otherwise we forget. History moves on and we remember Obama and we forget about Prop 8 and this other history of queer fight or struggle as well. And so we do, I think, tend to marginalize our queer characters, at least literature does, unless somebody, and probably it has to mean queer writers like us, take the trouble to make sure that we do not allow that to happen. And so I do see that as something that I very consciously did, is to make queerness be part of the political scene, of the home scene, of the social scene, so that they are not forgotten. Another thing that my book does, and I know that I felt like I needed to do, was put a little bit of the South Asian queer history into it as well. I mean, these are organizations like Trikon and Salga and all the rest that were so important to my coming out. And it seems like that kind of history is also kind of forgotten, or would be forgotten, if we don't make some attempt to put them in a place where the mainstream or somebody else would see it and not ignore it. So I think part of what I did while writing the book, and I had fun doing this, was to throw in these queer aspects, like a queer reading of Mughal-e-Azam, for example. I threw that into the book. Deepa Mehta's Fire, which was a big deal when it came out. Now it has like 2 lines in the current book. And there were previous drafts where there was more, but unfortunately, when going from 200,000 words to something that people could actually read, I had to take some of that out. So things like Khush and all the rest that have been relegated to our queer histories, I tried to put that into the novel so that there would be some representation of it, and people who read the novel now or maybe later would also know that those existed. Otherwise, there is this erasure that happens of marginalized queer characters and the organizations that support us. And I felt like that was part of what I wanted to do, was to embalm them in some way. Muted.
Sorry about that. That's so interesting and powerful. I want to give you each an opportunity maybe to ask one another a question before we conclude. So yes, I was just curious if you wanted to talk to one another.
Yes, I have a question for Nawaz. What was the final word count of the book?
We got it down to pretty much close to my first draft, which feels
so like half.
a crazy thing. We got it down like 2/3 of the way, so it was like 135,000 words eventually.
Wow.
So we cut roughly 1/3 of the book to get it back, and just via tightening and removing things that I felt are still important, but maybe the story did not really need.
To me, that's amazing, because all my books are under, I don't think I've ever written a book over 100,000 words, and I don't know if I could. So it takes a lot of patience and a lot of talent to be able to do that.
And a lot of doggedness. I don't know where that came from, but it was like, now I'm thinking maybe I should not have. Why? But that's it's a different matter. For Adiba, this is one thing I would like to ask, because I think I have to say that bringing this book out and a few months leading to it, one of the biggest challenges I had was just fear, like that there was this public coming out, and even though I've been out for so many years, I still had this terrible fear that now I was this publicly out, and therefore it was a new kind of coming out that I hadn't done before. How was that process of bringing your first book out and knowing it was going to be out in the world? How was that for you?
Yeah, I think it was interesting. I didn't necessarily think of it in that sense, but I do think I also felt a kind of fear, and I didn't know what it would look like, because obviously I had never experienced it before. So I think one of my main fears, and probably this was same to you, was what the response would be from the Muslim community. Because not a lot of books about queer Muslims exist out there, and there is a lot of resistance to understanding these narratives and understanding us. And I was pleasantly surprised, because other than like a few trolls on Twitter every once in a while, most of the response has been really, really positive. And I think any negative things that I see has been really kind of wiped out by the way a lot of younger Muslim teens reach out to me, and they say that I had never imagined a book like this, and this feels so true to me and to my life. And so even if maybe their life looks different, I'm glad that there is something there for them to read, because again, when I was younger, there was nothing. Just a few years ago, there was nothing. And I think writers like us, unfortunately, we are definitely writing into a blank space.
Yes.
So yes, definitely I felt that fear, but I think thankfully the fear didn't lead to anything negative. It only led to positive things for me.
No, that is great to know. And yeah, you're right. I mean, I'm thinking now, looking back at it, I was like, where was all that? And now that the book is out for 2 months, I'm like, this does feel different from what I feared. Yep. So yeah.
There's a final question from the audience that is so apt for this particular literary festival happening in the context of a larger South Asian film festival. So maybe we can close out with this question, which is, it asks, do you see your stories translating into films? And Adiba, I have to say that, you do such a great job of taking people's pleasures in certain genres like the rom-com and putting new stories and new characters into it, that it made me think of Crazy Rich Asians as a precursor to a kind of film for yours. And Nawaz, for you, I was of course thinking, partly because the narrator is a young born, the film adaptation of Midnight's Children came to mind for me. So yeah, I would be curious, and this is also clearly about genre for both of you.
I would like Adiba go first, because I think her books would definitely make wonderful rom-coms.
Thank you. Yes, I think, right now I do think there's more like rom-com movies coming out on the rise, and more young adult rom-coms as well. One of my favorite films is To All the Boys I've Loved Before, which was obviously a book by Jenny Han before. So, it would be amazing to see my book translated into a film in some way. It's definitely, a dream, and hopefully someday it can happen. But, I would like to reiterate, just like I said, Nawaz and I are almost writing into a blank space with the kind of representation. I think those films, if they came into existence, they would also be coming out into a blank space, because I think, in the film space also, there is definitely a lack. And so, I hope that film producers and directors and filmmakers, they are paying attention to, festivals like this, and looking at, where there is the lack and what they can do to fulfill it.
Mm.
Yeah, writing into the blank. Yes, I get that. In my case, I never thought of this book as a movie, just because I felt it was such a talky book. I mean, we have this baby talking and narrating this whole book, and I was like, that would never translate. But since the book has come out, there have been many people who've been saying that it's a cinematic book, and that that they can see the scenes, and now I'm thinking maybe there are some aspects of the book that won't translate, like it's like all those sermons and all the rest, which take up some part of the book. But the story itself, I think, with the three characters would be its own thing, its own movie or film or series or whatever. And I would be very happy to see that.
That's wonderful. I just want to thank each of you. I know that there are filmmakers listening to this right now who are probably salivating to take your works and transform them. And I'll just say, on behalf of the entire audience and for myself, to use Adiba's words, I want to thank both of you for filling some of those blank spaces with our corner of the world. It means everything. So thank you today, and thank you for your time and your insights.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chandan, for this, and Tasveer too for having us. And Adiba, this was a wonderful pleasure.